How can I draw architecture directly freehand in ink when every single mark I put on the paper will be there in the finished drawing? The problem I had was that I'd learnt to draw using a pencil underdrawing. When we do that, part of the techniques rely on the fact that we can erase all of the underdrawing at the end, but that clearly wasn't going to work for me. So how could I draw the architecture I wanted and get the results in the finished drawing I was after when nothing can be erased? I had to work out a whole new way of thinking and of putting marks on the paper. So here are 15 of those strategies. First point, because getting the proportions correct across the whole drawing is one of the biggest challenges drawing directly in ink. Where and how we start is crucial. We need to choose a part that we have the most chance of drawing accurately most easily. If possible, let it be in the center of the drawing. But at this point, where if you like drawing a ruler onto our paper, we're drawing something that we will measure the rest of the drawing from. So we need to make sure our ruler is accurate, so the rest of the drawing is accurate. I started with this section. I saw it as a series of shapes of certain proportion, where we had this shape, and this shape wider, narrower, wider than this one, narrower than that one, which I wanted to capture in my drawing. Because if I didn't get these proportions correct, then when I added the details, then I wouldn't have these wall spaces in the right proportion. So getting these veranda posts in the right place proportionately to each other and getting the right height for width of the gaps became my ruler, was my really important starting point. Second point, make sure that we choose a pen that's suitable for the detail that we're going to draw, the size we're going to draw it. Here I'm experimenting using a 0.5 and a 0.3mm pen to draw the same French doors. This sort of experimentation before we start the actual drawing helps us make the best choice of pen for the sort of drawing we're intending to do. So it's important I do this experimentation actual size of my finished drawing intention. Third point, notwithstanding the first point of choosing an area that we can draw accurately, where possible, start drawing at the center of attention of our finished drawing, which is probably the center of attention of our reference or the scene in front of us. And that's because what we draw at the start, we tend to draw still more slowly, more carefully, which gives a heavier line, a more precise technique. Whereas as we warm up and as we gain confidence during that drawing session, our marks tend to become faster, lighter, more gestural, better at capturing perhaps the feel of what we're trying to produce. And that tends to work better on the peripheries. We really want to draw the house before we start worrying too much about what comes around the house. This fourth point, you'll see me if you watch my demonstration videos use all the time, and that's using dots for positioning. So if I'm drawing down here, I've got this slight upward angle, which I want to capture, very slight. So this is straight ahead, so that's very slight. And then I can check, is that what I want? And that's all right. I also use dots when I'm working out, say, the position in here. I might use dots just along the ground there, and then I'm working out this space, and then this one's not so wide, and then this one is something in between, and I think, is that right? No, this first one doesn't look wide enough, so need to come significantly out, and now reposition this one, and then this one. So now I can more confidently even move this one across slightly, and then this one. And all of these extra marks really won't be noticeable in the finished drawing. When I'm drawing the roof, I'll put a dot where I think key points such as this corner are, and I'll use that to visualize the distance So I'll do a dot for here, say, and then I'll do a dot for here, and I'll be looking at this distance, this distance, this distance in proportion to each other to work out, is that right? I'll be noticing that from here to here is actually about the same distance as from there to there. And that will say to me, this is a little bit too high, come down a little bit, because this is about the same as this. And it's these dots that let me visualize in my mind how my drawing is going to look if I position what I draw next at that place. This next point is, don't rush to draw lines in a boxy way that create a very strong geometric shape feel. Because the lines we put on the paper do more than define shape. They also convey the feel, the effect visually of what we're looking at. Heavy outlines can look cartoonish, and it can stop us seeing the overall object. Just imagine in this drawing, if I'd drawn heavy lines down this tower instead of these light ones that even I varied at certain parts. What I would have had was a tower where we actually saw the silhouette more than we saw the surface. By keeping these lines light, it let me put a focus on the coursework without having to draw all the stones. And it let me keep the features of the tower far more prominent than if the whole thing had been enclosed with heavy lines. Another strategy is that when I have long lines, I underdraw them. So I'm drawing this line across here, and I put a position in dot to help me see where I want it to go. But when I'm drawing this line at this point, I have nothing else to reference. I don't know really how far it's going to be. My technique is to always underdraw the length at this point, confidently shorter than I think it needs to go. Because then when I've drawn more of my drawing and I can work out just how far I do want it to go, then I can add that part. And it means I don't have drawings where I have lines going off past the place I want them to be. Another helpful technique I use, particularly in the very first marks I make for a new part of the drawing, is I hold my pen at a very acute angle. And I use a brand of pen where by doing that, I can actually get a lighter line, as opposed to holding the pen higher up so that the nib is more directly on the paper. This lets me make some marks that really are very close to guidelines when I'm still trying to work out exact positioning. And then I can come down more confidently on the parts I want to. Not every type of nib lets this happen as well as other types. So you may need to try a few brands. I use Copic and I find that works well. Now we come on to a couple of perspective things. The first one is, if we're drawing architecture, always find eye level. It fast tracks our understanding of any other perspective issues in our scene. Eye level is simply the level of the eyes of the person looking at the scene. If it's a photo, it's the level of the camera. It's where we see a horizontal line. So here we see a line that slopes up to the left. Here we see it slopes slightly in the other direction. So eye level is going to be between the two somewhere, because it's where, instead of sloping one way or sloping the other way, the line is horizontal. Eye level is going to be somewhere around here. It's not necessarily where the eye level of a person in the scene would be, because once I've established eye level, I know that every horizontal line above will slightly increase in angle the higher it becomes from eye level, and it's the same below eye level but in the other direction. That will help me see these angles, and because I'm now seeing the angles quite clearly, even where they're quite subtle, it's going to be easier to draw them accurately. This next point quickly follows on from that. If we have a horizontal line for eye level, and if above that every horizontal line increases in angle, or below that increases in angle, what we get is a fan pattern. And so I always look to see the fan pattern in my scene, and then I make sure that as my lines go up, even if they're quite close together in the scene, such as between here and here and here, I make sure I increase them ever so slightly. And I also pay attention to lines such as this one. This is part of the fan shape, this chimney line up there, and it has to follow the same pattern that all the horizontal lines follow. Since I'm using this drawing as an example for at least some of these points, I'll make the end screen link to this video to this drawing demo where you can watch me draw the whole thing in practice, hear the voiceover I did for this specific drawing, but also see many of these principles being put into practice one after the other. And I really recommend that you do that so that you can consciously try and spot as many of these 15 points from a learning experience point of view that will really reinforce your memory and understanding of these points. This next freehand ink drawing point is to do with foreshortening. The fact that as objects move further away from us, such as down the street here, visually they appear to narrow. So while this window from here to here in life is the same width as this window from here to here, if I were to measure that distance and this distance, then clearly this one is narrower than that one. And the ones in between spread that difference. If I know this happens from perspective theory, I can look out for it and see it more quickly, more clearly in my reference. And then I can make sure I capture the width difference in my drawing. And I particularly pay attention to the difference between the widest and the narrowest, so that when I do the ones in between, I can be reducing the width, not just of the windows, but the gaps between the windows. Capturing the foreshortening correctly is essential if we want to create a realistic look to our architecture drawings. This next one is possibly the most significant single thing I have done in my drawing, I think, to improve it. I've switched the way I think so that I don't think of drawing by putting lines on the paper. I think of drawing as putting marks on the paper, and lines are simply one of the marks I can use. Sometimes, often, especially with architecture, the best mark. I couldn't really draw this without lines for these key architectural elements. And yet, because I'm thinking marks when I look at my reference, I'm not rushing to draw straight lines across parts of the scene where if we have a line focus in our thinking, it's very easy to do, which then, when we draw directly in ink, takes away the opportunity to actually create the effect that we see, which isn't a heavy, straight, smooth edge, but is a far more varied, nuanced effect. And where in fact, we don't want the same heavy effect visually down here that we have up here, because when we look at our scene, this is a much stronger, attention-grabbing, darker, more emphasized area than down here. And we want to capture the difference. If I do a line here and a line here, I've now lost the ability to create a stronger visual focus where it exists in life. And now I'm making my drawing look less realistic. We clearly limit our drawings severely if we're only thinking of one way of putting the ink on the paper than an infinite number of ways. This gives me so much more to choose from to create the visual effect I'm after. This point is, understand that we're always going to be simplifying the detail that we see. Don't fall into the trap of really anywhere of trying to draw all the detail that we can see in the reference. I start every drawing with a scrap of paper where I play around with some aspect of the scene where there's detail to work out how I'm going to capture the feel of the detail without getting bogged down in drawing it precisely. Now, when I go to do my actual drawing, I have a stronger strategy in my mind for what I'm going to do and a bit of confidence with my line work in doing it. This next point, generally leave detail till later. Sometimes we need to put the detail in. I find at least to position the windows and the doors is important at the start to help me check that I've got the proportions correct. And if I've made a serious error, it's great to discover that in the first few minutes of a drawing when we can bail and start again. At the start though, I'm more concerned with establishing a reasonable amount of my main subject and getting, if you like, the scope established. This doesn't mean we draw the detail. It might mean, such as here, that I do basically a dotted line approximately coming down here that I will use to position the large scale elements of this old house. Lets me then check this line, this line, this line. But when I start to add the detail, I start with the focal point of the detail that I want to have in more detail as a stronger attention grabber. I don't want to start drawing this prematurely and do too much detail here, again, so that it draws the eye away from the more significant points of visual interest. So I don't rush to detail if it's not necessary for accuracy of proportion. And when I do start detail, I start with what is the visual focus point, because I'll then use that to work out how much less detail to draw in more peripheral parts. If you watch my drawing demo video, I align what I'm going to draw with what I've already drawn. I talked about how I drew this part of this first. When I came to drawing the roof on top, I aligned this corner firstly in the reference by drawing a straight line down. And that said to me, it's just to the left of the doorway. And so I go up and establish the point. I do the same with the chimney, and so forth. The more accurate our drawing is, the more exactly and faster doing this works. Sometimes I need to accept that what I've drawn already isn't as accurate to the reference as I would like, and so after I see from the reference what the alignment is, I might have to make adjustments as to where I put this now in my drawing to get the best possible outcome. But doing this will still enable me to get the best possible outcome. This final point I find is crucial to get a drawing at the end that draws the eye and moves it around, and that's to deliberately work at a tempo and maintaining a tempo, and not the same tempo. I've already talked several times about how at the start we tend to go more slowly, more carefully, because we need to. How the more we've drawn, the more we have to reference, and the faster we can start to draw, and also because we start to develop more confidence, more eye-hand coordination. So towards the end of the drawing, we're going faster, more easily, more confidently. We're also moving into the peripheral areas of our drawing. I find it very productive to deliberately pick up the tempo towards the end. Almost like I have a ticking clock that's counting down to a pens down alarm at the end, so that I become more and more quick, more and more gestural, more and more simplified, looser and looser in my marks. All of this will focus attention back on the more intentional, tighter, more detailed, closer marks, which is what I want because they're in my focal point. I really will be able to simplify things in ways that will help put attention where I want it. Often create a very realistic effect with very little ink on the paper. It's so easy towards the end of a drawing to do the opposite, to start to slow down, and that's when we start to overdraw things, particularly things that don't matter so much. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. You should be seeing the end screen with the link to the demo of this drawing. Why not, if you haven't seen it, watch it and have a go drawing it yourself. But look, in the end, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.